Hello everyone and welcome to another incredible battle that took place on board 1 in a match between MGD1 and Kaz Chess. We have Arjun Erigaisi versus Richárd Rapport. We already mentioned Arjun not doing all that impressive. Out of his last 5 games he got half a point. Okay, his opponents were some incredible players. He faced Nodrbek, Anand Alireza, Vincent Keimer and Volodar Murzin. But still, when someone like Arjun is playing, you don't, half a point out of the possible 5 is not the first thing that comes to mind. Whereas Richárd, he had that loss to Boris Gelfand, but then he defeated Jordan Van Forest, Shahriar Mamedyarov in that beautiful game that we've seen in the previous video. If you haven't seen it, do watch this after this video. And then Rauf Mamedov immediately after Mamedyarov, and he completely obliterated him with the white pieces. So now he has black, and yeah, he's playing against a very wounded Arjun, but you don't become an elite by having that influence you. So let's check it out and see what happens here. Arjun with white opens with pawn to e4, and of course Richárd wants to fight from the start, pawn to c5. We have the Sicilian defense, knight of 3, knight to c6, and pawn to d4. We have c captures on d4, knight captures, knight to f6, and the knight to c3. And here you have the Sveshnikov or the Pelikan or the Lasker variation, however you prefer to call it. You could go for the classical Sicilian with pawn to d6. Here we have pawn to e6. This is the 4 knights variation of the Sicilian, and can transpose into many other lines, and it's very, very dangerous for both players. So you really have to know your theory here. And we have knight d to b5. Okay, pawn to d6, as you want to get, you don't want this knight to end up on d6, so d6, and now bishop to f4, going for the d6 pawn. Once again, we have pawn to e5 and bishop to g5. In the olden days, even bishop to e3 was popular, and I myself, if sometimes, I go for this, but I rarely do with white, I go for this bishop to e3 move, because there are some, crazy lines like bishop to e3, a6, so you can sacrifice the knight with knight e5, and then, it's nothing spectacular, but your opponent will burn a few seconds if you're playing bullet or maybe 3-minute blitz. So here, pawn to a6, we have knight to a3, and okay, you could also, instead of knight to a3, just capture on f6, as if queen captures, knight to c7 check will win the rook, but black will happily capture with the g-pawn, and black is very happy with this central setup. And now after knight to a3, just pawn to f5, rook g8, and black is doing awesome here. So that's why after a6 we have knight to a3, pawn to b5, again still all very, very known theory. We have knight to d5, now putting pressure on f6, and bishop to e7. And now, while you could eliminate the bishop and sort of claim that you have the bishop pair, after knight captures on e7, it's not that impressive of a bishop pair. I mean, your e-pawn is hanging, so probably bishop captures is the best move, and d5 is coming. Pretty much whatever you play next, and you don't have time for pawn to c4, which is sometimes played in these lines, as, like I said, the e4 pawn is hanging. So after bishop to e7, we have bishop captures on f6, we have bishop captures, and now pawn to c3. Another popular line is pawn to c4, but c3 much more popular. We have rook to b8, now with some b4 action planned, knight to c2, fighting for b4, and now bishop to g5, taking away all of this pressure from the knight on d5. So now the bishop controls the knight, and also you have support on that f4 square. We have pawn to a4, challenging the b5 pawn, and of course b captures on a4, knight c to b4. And okay, you have a knight on b4, so you don't have to worry about your b2 pawn. And the question is, okay, of course you cannot play a5 as the knight here, knight on c6 is hanging, so you first have to tend to that. Knight captures, and now just bishop to d7. Again, you don't have time for this, as knight to c6 would fork the rook and the queen. So bishop to d7, and now bishop captures on a6, finally eliminating that pawn. And interestingly, Arjun already had this game against Vidit in 2021, where Vidit continued with queen to a5. Queen to a5 is the top move recommended by the engine. Richárd goes for castle's kingside, which is the second move recommended by the engine. Obviously, both of them are perfectly fine. It's just that, this one is 0.00, this one is 0.01. So, okay, castles, but still, we're not entering new territory. We have castles kingside, bishop back to e7, now guarding the d6 pawn, and queen to e2. And here, we finally reach new territory. There is a move where, a game where g6 was played, and g6 is the top move recommended by the engine. It was played in the game in 2007 between Iwasaki Yudai and Sergei Klyucharev in Kemerovo in Russia. Okay, like I said, it's the best move recommended by the engine. The player with black won this game. But here we have pawn to f5 by Rapport, and it is now as of move 19 that we have a completely new game. So okay, quite a lot of theory, but you can see that Arjun not really having an issue with this. He's still above 15 minutes, and you start with 15 minutes on the clock. Rapport burning some time. Okay, so definitely more interesting than pawn to g6, but obviously with more risk. So what does Arjun play? E captures on f5. Okay, you give up the center. Now Rapport controls the center. Rook captures on f5 and bishop to d3. Chasing the rook away, rook to f8, and now bishop to c2. A very useful move as you go after the a4 pawn, and you still have the option of going queen d3, queen e4 to put pressure on that h7 pawn. The knight will come to d5 at some point. You don't even have to worry about the b2 pawn, because if, let's say, knight d5, rook b2, you can capture and then pick up the rook on b2. So it's a very nice position for white. We have queen to e8, Rapport defends on a4, and now queen d1, introducing a third attacker on this a4 pawn. Simple chess, but simple chess is, what strongest players are able to, play. We have rook to a8, defending the pawn once again, and now finally knight to d5 as the rook moved away from the b file. So rook back to b8, Rapport says, I will gladly trade my a pawn for your b pawn, and you think, okay, maybe that's not such a good idea, let's bring the knight back, let's try and figure out something else. No, Arjun just captures it. Rook, not with the rook, he plays bishop captures on a4. And okay, we have rook captures on b2 and bishop back to b3. You could also trade, but this looks very interesting as it traps the rook on b2. So now imagine some knight e3, knight c4, and the rook has nowhere to go. You're going to have to give it up for the bishop, and you're going to be down the exchange. So king to h8, first unpinning from this diagonal, and now knight to e3, so basically winning a tempo there, and queen to g6. Very, very sneaky maneuver by Rapport, as if Arjun continues with knight to c4, which was definitely one plan, then Rapport had a bishop to g4 in mind, and you lose the queen. There's nothing you can do. Okay, you're going to win some material for it, like knight captures, bishop captures, and knight captures, but still, black will definitely be better here. The point is that after knight to c4 and bishop to g4, you cannot play f3, as here comes rook captures on g2 with check, and after king captures, bishop captures with a double check, and that's pretty much it. King f2, and you just go for checkmate. King e3, bishop to g5, king to d3, and now a simple bishop to e4 will be checkmate. So that is, something along the lines of what Rapport has in mind. Of course, not that particular line, but it's a crazy position. Anything could happen. So Arjun plays rook a7. He says, all right, both of your bishops are undefended. What are you even doing? Now you have the bishops there that are undefended, and I'm also going to win your rook at some point. But Rapport just plays bishop to g5. Here you could just play something like bishop to e6, and okay, everything is defended because you put pressure on that bishop. But no, bishop to g5. And the question is what to play here. Again, Richárd creates a complete mess of a position where most of the lines are fine. Some of them are incredibly deadly and, packed with poison. But there is just one that gives edge to Arjun. Can you spot this? And could Arjun have spotted it after, having half a point out of the previous 5 games that he played? Have at it while I give you a couple of seconds. The only move that gives edge to white, and Arjun did find it, is bishop to c2. This is the key idea. You have to take away the square from the queen. The point is that if you capture on d7 and allow bishop captures on e3, you can't recapture due to checkmate on g2. And yes, you can still play the position with rook captures on d6. You attack the queen, but now look at this. Rook captures on f2. Now you don't have time to capture the queen, as the rook captures will be checkmate. It's going to be checked from the rook and the bishop here. So you're going to have to trade something like captures, bishop captures with check, king h1, and now queen wherever, something like queen g5. And it's a crazy position. Passed c-pawn versus the passed e-pawn. Both players have a weak king, bishops of opposite colors. it's either player could win this. But after bishop g5, Arjun played bishop to c2, which is by far the best move, and now there's a problem. Richárd plays queen to e6, and now look at this, bishop to f5. Even though that square is guarded more than enough, obviously still not enough because of the back rank. And now the question is what to play here. There is one move that you could play, but there's no way you find this move. Not even, you know, in 100 years. If you pause the video, if you guys, you know, want to try it, be my guest. I'm not gonna, you know, stop you, but I'm gonna show it to you. So if you want, you can stop now. The move is queen to e8. This is the only move that holds, or sort of holds. Point being that you have to play rook captures on d7 and allow rook captures on f5, sort of to threaten the rook here. And then, okay, rook captures on d6, you win the pawn, and then something like rook back to f8, and the game continues. White is better, but, you know, you still have to fight, and it's going to be one hell of a game. But after queen to e8, a move that really comes to mind is bishop captures on d7. And the problem why this doesn't work is that, look at this, queen to b8. Okay, it doesn't look like much. You're attacking the rook. The rook goes back, but now look at this. Rook captures on f2. So what now? Bishop captures on e3 is coming next. So let's say knight g4. Now look at this. Rook captures on g2. Okay, you have the h2 pawn defended by the knight, so no problem. King h1, but now pawn to h5. You want to kick away the knight and just deliver a nice checkmate here. So knight f2. And now rook g captures on f2, rook captures, and now something like bishop to c6. Luckily, white gets control over this diagonal, otherwise it would be a very, very quick death for that white king, and also threatens rook to a8. But you can play queen to g8, and now after rook to a8, sort of winning the queen, you just go back, rook to f8. Now bishop to d5, attacking the queen, and you can't really go anywhere. You have to give up the queen. Rook captures, bishop captures on g8, rook captures, and now something like queen captures on d6, and you get this position where it's queen versus rook and bishop, but overall it's a draw. For example, e4, c4, you're going to play e3, c5, rook to e8, put the rook behind the passed pawn, and now you have to go for this. You attack the pawn, you attack the rook, rook to e5, and now let's say captures, king to g8, and queen e2, you have to block it, but the e3 pawn is defended, so you're just going to gobble up the c5 pawn. But I would say it is much easier to play with the rook and bishop than the queen here, and chances are, it would be black would be winning this, not white. But you have to find a move like queen t8. If any of you even thought of queen t8, you should, definitely start playing professional chess. But okay, rook captures on f5 by Richárd, and now knight captures on f5, queen captures, and rook to a8 with check, bishop to c8, and now Arjun played queen to f3. I thought queen to d3 was way cooler, as you know, it's a very shocking move, looks like a queen sacrifice, but then rook captures will be checkmate. But okay, like I said, half a point out of the last 5 games. He's not trying to, win any popularity contests here. So pawn to g6, there's nothing better. Obviously, if the queen is captured, this is still checkmate. So g6, and now Arjun just trades down into a much better endgame. We have queen captures on f5, g captures, rook captures on c8 with check, king to g7, and rook to c7 check. King to g6, and now rook to d1. Going after that pawn with check. So pawn to d5, hoping for, rook captures on d5, and of course none of you are looking at that, as rook to b1 will be checkmate. So rook to c6 with check, we have king to h5, and now rook to e6, just trying to destroy the strong center. We have pawn to e4, and now rook to e5, and this rook will now start eliminating the pawns. Pawn to f4, and rook e captures on d5. We have pawn to e3, captures, and rook to e1. And now king to g4. And all of a sudden, Rapport now has a passed pawn on e3, and it's defended by the bishop, so you're never capturing that pawn. But now comes pawn to h3, check, king to h4, and what do you play here? I mean, seems like g3 is such a beautiful move. You kick the king away, or you force the king to capture, and then you capture the bishop on g5. But g3 here would be a huge mistake, because if you play this, king captures on h3, and now you do win the bishop, but rook g2 check, and it's a draw. You cannot avoid a perpetual here due to the pawn here guarding the f2 square. So rook f2 is also check, and it will be a very, very simple perpetual. So that's why Arjun played rook captures on g5. He gives back the exchange, but he goes into a winning rook and pawn endgame. King captures and rook captures on e3. Now he's just up 2 pawns in a completely winning rook and pawn endgame. So let's see how he does it. Or maybe Rapport has, you know, maybe a few rabbits left up his sleeve. We have rook to c2 and king to h2. We have pawn to h5, doing what he can. King to g3, and now pawn to h4 check. We have king f3, king to f5, and now rook to d3. Okay, king to e5, we have rook e3 check, king to f5, and pawn to g4 with check, allowing Rapport to trade en passant. So h captures, we have king captures, and the rook to c1. So now, how do you start advancing these pawns? Let's see how Arjun does it. Rook f3 check, king g5, we have king to f2, rook to c2 check, and king to e1. We have rook to a2 and king to d1. Now he wants to get the king all the way to the rook, and then force the rook up the board to start advancing the pawn. We have rook b2, king c1, rook a2, and finally pawn to c4. Rook to a4 attacks the pawn, but now rook to c3, and the rook is now behind the passed pawn. King f6, king b2, we have rook to a8 and rook to e3, cutting off the king from entering this half of the board, so you don't have to worry about the king and the rook going after your pawn. King f5, king c3, we have king f4 and rook to e1, just keeping the king cut off. Rook to c8, and now pawn to h4. We have king to g4, rook to h1, and king to h5, king to b4, and now rook to b8 check, king a5, rook a8 check, and king to b6. And he was in this position on move 69 that Richárd Rapport resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here. So Arjun stops Rapport's legendary run and you know, stops his own series of losses, which was just terrible to watch. So, you know, a little bit for everyone. You know, tough break for Rapport, but you know, great stuff for Arjun. What are you gonna do? And here you resign because well, there's just no way. This king has to stay here, otherwise this pawn marches forward, and there's no way for the rook to stop the king. You sound like check, king c7, rook a8, pawn to c5, rook a7 check, king b6, rook a8, c6, and okay, now the rook will try to go behind the pawn, but you will stop it. Rook c1, and okay, now rook b2 check, and you go after the rook. And now once the rook goes all the way up the board, you will play c7, and after rook to c8, that's it. This is defended. The king will just march its way up the board, and something like after rook c8, let's say rook c4, you can also defend the pawn. You don't have to give it up. And something like this, the rook comes up the board, black has to make a move, and once black makes a move, you queen the pawn, captures, and that's it. Now you just either checkmate the black king right away, or queen the pawn first and then checkmate. But of course, I know you guys know all of this, so no worries there. So I hope you enjoyed that. Brilliant stuff by Arjun. Rapport again was playing very inspiring chess. He had some crazy ideas, as you've seen. Arjun saw through them, and this time it did not work. This time Arjun was impervious to magic. Hope you enjoyed it. I would like to thank Brian Willits, Obakeng Rafela, Norman Duda, Justin and Olaf Love Chess, and Muhammad Babar Khalil for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing to check upon your wonderful suggestions and whatever else happens in the chess world. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.